Okay, welcome to the first i3 Digital webinar of 2018. And this webinar today is on digital trends in 2018, so quite apt for anybody who's thinking about doing new projects this year. Thanks a lot for joining us today. We'll just do a couple of bits of housekeeping before we get on to the main part of the presentation. So if you have any questions at all today, please use the questions log on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you ask questions in there, we'll try and answer them as we're going along, but if not, we will come to them at the end. So please don't get upset and leave us. On the webinar today, there are two people. There is me. I'm John Eaton. I'm the Head of Digital Strategy and Sales at i3 Digital. And I've also got Stephen Currie with me here as well. Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, no worries.
Stephen, on this. Go on, Stephen.
No worries. How you doing, folks? Stephen Currie, UX designer and front-end designer here at i3, working alongside John. So it's great to be here today. Thank you.
Good stuff. Okay, so just before we carry on, obviously you can interact with us on Twitter. We've left our hashtags there. And the next webinar, in case you're interested, is at the beginning of February, Monday the 5th of February. And that's on CMS and CRM integration, and that's at the same time, just on a Monday, at the beginning of next month. So, in terms of the agenda today, we're going to be covering off four key areas, really. The first of which is voice search, which seems to be causing a lot of excitement, particularly with the strong sales for Alexa over the Christmas period. Also, Echo, as she's called. I call her Alexa because I'm very fond of her. The next bit we're going to touch on is UX and the Internet of Things. There's a lot of trend at the moment towards moving away from physical screens and browsing experiences.
I don't know that.
Sorry, Alexa, stop. So there's a lot of movement there within changing trends within digital. And as a consequence of all this, why we're expecting to see more proper integration work in 2018. And by proper integration, we mean moving beyond just feeds of information on site and actually true bi-directional information, just to enrich customer experiences and to enable more business process. The final area we're going to touch on is how all of this moves us towards a full Agile approach towards projects rather than wAgile or Agile, as I heard it called yesterday, where a lot of the requirements are defined up front. Don't worry, this isn't a pitch on the fact that Agile is better than waterfall. There's definitely good reasons for using both. But there are certainly, within some of the trending things that are going on at the moment, some good reasons to look at how Agile could help. And finally, at the end, we've got a formal Q&A where we can touch on anything that hasn't been answered as part of the presentation that you want to know about. So the first part we're going to talk about is voice search. And the reason for that is that there is a lot of movement in this. And according to Google last year, 60% of searches for mobiles were done via voice search. So it's particularly, I think, for the millennials coming through, a very popular way of them being able to access information. There's a lot of trends within voice search. It's largely semantic. So people are looking for information in and around a particular area. They're looking for answers to questions. So FAQs are particularly important in terms of being visible via voice search. And also comparison seems to be a growing area as well. So tell me the best things in, or what is the differences between. Those are good ways of using voice search for your organization powerfully. And finally, as I alluded to at the start, Amazon Echo topped the iOS and Android marketplaces for downloads over Christmas in 2017, which is impressive considering the amount of apps that are available. So clearly, whereas last year it might have been seen that Echo and Echo and Google Home were two products that were sort of new to the market and a bit innovative and interesting, there now seems to be much more consumer demand. So in terms of voice search then, I thought we'd do a little bit of an experiment. You can probably hear behind me that we do have an Amazon Echo in the room. So we're just going to start off by saying, Alexa, what is Sitecore?
Sitecore is a customer experience management company that provides web content management and multi-channel marketing automation software.
Thank you. So in that situation there, obviously, the CMS Sitecore has been recognised by Alexa, and she had brought back the right response. But then if you compare that against this, so Alexa, what is Kentico?
Kill has many distinct meanings, including as a verb, 1. Cause to die, put to death, usually
Stop.
Intentionally or knowingly.
Alexa,
2.
stop. So as you can see there, that wasn't the best result, but we can try again. Maybe my pronunciation wasn't quite right there. So Alexa, what is EpiServer?
Here's something I found on Wikipedia. Furthermore, for their communications, PP users don't depend on any specific platform, message transport system.
Alexa, stop. So you can see there that within the market that we work in, which is predominantly CMS, there's quite a lot of difference between how Amazon Echo, because I'm not going to say Alexa again, is finding the information. And if you look at how Google search results pages are structured, there's very little to kind of tell you why Echo is favouring one of these terms over the other. So in terms of the Sitecore reference that was read out there, it's actually the annotation that goes alongside their Google Plus. So where it says Sitecore is a customer experience management company on the right-hand side, that obviously exists there. But from an SEO point of view, Kentico have done the same thing. So why is it that for some reason Sitecore is working and Kentico isn't? Part of it could be down to popularity. Sitecore is better known, and obviously a leader within the CMS world, although Kentico is obviously a challenger. The other thing it could be is down to phonetics. So we're wondering whether that could be the reason. Ultimately, the answer here is that it's very difficult to tell absolutely, because the intellectual property of Amazon with the Echo product would be poor for them to give out to everybody else. So there's a lot of people speculating on how voice search is working. But one thing I noticed, which I thought might be important, is this. So if you look at the two search terms there that are used within Google, you can see that Kentico has roughly 10% of the impressions or the results of Sitecore. If you put in both of those as semantic searches for what is Kentico, what is Sitecore. So that would be interesting, just initially, to sort of show you that there's obviously differences within even brand terms of what Amazon Echo can bring back. So does it matter? Well, I suppose you've got to wonder who is actually going to sit in a boardroom and make decisions by asking Amazon Echo at this point. But I like this picture because although that sounds really unusual right now, there's probably a situation within the not too distant future when that could definitely happen. So I suppose the other thing to think about is whether or not this is indicative of more broad terms within the search marketing strategy or the acquisition strategy for customers within these organizations, and whether you can use the example of Amazon Echo as a way to spot any particular potential problems that you've got. So now I'm going to pass on to Stephen, who's going to talk to you a bit about UX and the Internet of Things.
Yeah, no worries, guys. Just as John's speaking there, a lot of emerging trends that are happening here in 2018. One of the more predominant ones, as which we're covering here, is voice and voice user interface design. This is a fairly new thing, and it will impact user experience. It's the fact that it's kind of how mobile touchscreens came about, and this, that took a long time to adopt. Way back, even in 2006, when it was LG launched the Pradaphone, even before the iPhone, which is mid 2007. Touch screens been around for quite some time. We're still developing for that. It was predominantly quite a slow process, but now the presumption is that voice UI is going to be very, very rapid, and we can already see it, as John in the background there has his Echo, and again, these are now being integrated or are intended to be integrated with devices around the home. And these sort of environments are extremely exciting, but as designers, we need to be aware of how to lead users down these funnels and user journeys and how to carry out practices. So as this slide iterates, adding to cart, buy now, these are all, UI elements that exist, and people have now become so used to call to actions that we need to make sure that we're designing processes that people are vocally carrying out these tasks. And as you say, there are devices for this, and the popularity behind them is it varies quite greatly. So I guess if we move on to the next one there, John, we'll see what else we've got. So the voices should be based on persona research. And as I mentioned, the voice user interface comes with a lot of research, exactly how we currently do our UX process. You're looking at the people that you're actually designing for, your demographics, and these voices that we choose, one of the most common misunderstandings for a lot of examples, even for the likes of, telephone systems that we're all familiar with, we don't enjoy, 90% of people don't enjoy talking to automated voices. And it's not necessarily that the software or the interface is wrong. It's the design and the thought process behind it that isn't communicating with us in a conversational way. And that's where this persona comes into play, between the role of what it's actually trying to do and appeal to that persona. Giving a bit of empathy there. If it's, say, a medical telephone line, you're phoning up for medication, people don't necessarily want to hear a voice actor that's been hired, that's, full of joy and happy. If they're maybe getting medication because they're unwell, they're not in the spirit of, that mentality. Again, it has to reflect the company and the brand image. And again, familiarity to the target audience. The persona should be familiar to users. But again, with research, similar to our typical UX process, different cultures work well within certain demographics, and these are all very, very apparent. And it's where you need to have a lot of exposure and transparency to make sure you're finding your right tone of voice, essentially, there. And John, I think you've done a bit of research behind this new advert campaign from the Army over here, haven't you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in that it's not totally aligned to what we do as a digital specialist, but actually it completely, hammers the message about how if you are creating a voice or a personality behind the campaign, just in the way that the Army have done, it needs to have some resonance back with the core target market. So where the Army's getting absolutely sort of hammered at the moment is that no one's denying that it's important for the Army to give a strong message of inclusiveness and not to be discriminatory in any way. But I think the problem with this is that the core persona group of people or groups of people who would join the Army haven't been considered in terms of the overall messaging. So there's a lot of criticism out there at the moment for this advert because it seems so at odds with the sort of core message that people want to see. Which I think brings us on to our next slide, which is just to talk about two of the things that we do, if you wouldn't mind, Stephen, that helps to avoid the possibility of completely missing the mark when we're doing a new piece of work for a client.
Exactly. Like as John says, missing the mark is so important, and you must have a preliminary, a set in stone research process of having a clear objective. You need, what are your assumptions of how this user and this demographic, how are they going to get involved with your product or service? And to get that research, what methods are you going to use? And we at i3, we like doing everything from user surveys to face-to-face interviews, because that's where it comes down to, again, referring back to voice. A person's tone it's a key part to illustrating their emotional state, how empathetic they are to maybe the device that they're using, or the product or the service or the company. Even mannerisms that you can visually see in this case. People may say they're happy with the product, but their bodies, their body language, all these are aspects that we consider in the interview process. And then maybe more remote, as I mentioned, user surveys and usability testing. These are all methods, that you can conduct at the start of your research process, and that will get you the information to hone in on your personas you're able to start to figure out, the objectives that these people have, their needs, their goals, pain points that they on a daily basis of using this product, where the frustrations are, where there's information gaps, and why is this person going to purchase this device, this Echo in the first place, or what are they searching for, what is it solving? And again, all of this comes down to, when we're trying to relate it to this environment, it's conversational. It's like talking to a person. Why do they have this problem, and how can you speak to them from your heart? Be empathetic. All of this is very, very important at this stage of the research process, and finding these demographics so that you can speak to them is so important, because people more easily relate to a product or service, systems, and even the experience when they're able to connect on a personal level. It's the same for friendship between people, and if people want to get used to these devices, they're treating them almost as like I say, family members, friends. There's case studies. People have mentioned that they favor the Amazon Echo, and I hope, John, this doesn't set off Alexa, but they prefer using the name Alexa, because it gives it a sense of personality when they're speaking to it, like it's another entity in their life, as opposed to speaking to a machine or a device with Google Home. It creates that connection.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the key thing to mention, obviously, is from this slide, obviously, that you need to have an underpinning basis on real research and context to make success out of screenless experiences. So I think just moving on to the next stage, I think you're going to be talking next about using voice search purely as a gatekeeper, and actually that's completely, I think you're going to say, not the right thing to do.
Oh yeah, definitely. As we mentioned, it's to be a gatekeeper or to catch information. It's not really, you're not achieving a goal there. You're not going to be solving anybody's problems approaching it in that regard. It needs to be conversational. People need to be comfortable with these devices that they're speaking to, and it's up to us as designers and working on these voice user interfaces. We have to be able to conversationally navigate these people through a process, and just collecting information and running those off and firing back assumed answers. That's going to cause friction. And voice user interfaces and voice interaction, it's already quite an alien concept to some people. Millennials, yes, are used to it potentially with Siri, as we mentioned, Alexa, and Google Home, things like that. But older demographics, silver servers, this is all going to be so new to them. So we need to make sure that we are appealing to these markets, but also making it accessible with the ease of use, and feeding them information to make sure that they don't get lost and they're not running blind through this process. Otherwise, we're not going to be solving problems, and that is the key point of why we even do any user experience research, to figure out where the problems lie and to solve them.
I think that's a really interesting angle, actually, because I think one of the big criticisms of online help and chatbots like Ask Anna are that they start by asking you for information, whereas actually the user's problem can often be anything. Which, again, going back to your point there about Echo versus Google Home, 3 times more popular, and probably a large part of the reason for that is because, like you say, it's very personal. It allows you to take control of the conversation as the user, rather than being asked to provide information, which is sort of almost seen a bit like those unhelpful phone lines that have been in place now for the last 10 years or so, that aim to try and stop you from talking to anybody who's actually going to be able to help you. So I think you've obviously got that level of user bias already before you even start with this sort of stuff. So anything you can do to give power to them is obviously going to help. Moving on to, I think, your last point on this is having to think more carefully about user journeys. Is that right, Stephen?
Yeah, exactly. Because visually, again, there are advantages to working with a visual medium, from desktop devices to mobile devices. On screen, we can aid users with the likes of navigation systems. Through cognitive, recognition, people are able to see the search bar. They're able to see the magnifying glass icon, the home button, the contact button. they see call to actions, they recognize these UI elements, and even breadcrumbs on a website that steers people and allows them to know where they are in their their user flow, and where they are in the website, or even in a buying process in a shopping cart. Stripping that all back to a blind interface with voice interaction, we have to be so careful that we're creating an environment that they're comfortable and they're not getting lost. They are going to encounter blockers like in any process, but it's up to us to design questions that filter and funnel, but again, as I mentioned before, on a conversational level. So for example, asking about the weather, you can just reply back, what's it going to be like today weather-wise. The reply could simply be sunny. That's not productive for anyone, and that cancels the conversation. And if you were face to face with a person and asking them, what's it like outside, and they just went sunny, you're not getting a lot of information. There's no connection there. You're getting kind of blanked, essentially. You're not going to feel connected. Following up with, today's weather, for weather forecast, mostly dry and sunny, as I say, rather than just a short answer. And you could follow that up with, would you like to know the weather for the next 7 days? You're leading them on that user journey, encouraging them to make
stuff then, isn't it? That's important.
Yeah.
The ability to kind of create intelligent systems that pull together that kind of cognitive insight, which I think is some of the stuff you've been doing on some of our clients more recently. So this example here, it's starting to map out an overall mental process for a customer, isn't it? Is that right? Is that kind of what you're trying to do?
Very much so. And it's not just a case of working out a flow diagram saying, will they answer yes, no? There's, as you were saying earlier about phonetics and so forth, these systems need to be very adaptive to understand, colloquialisms and, how people answer questions very differently. I know it's not related potentially to the voice aspect of things, but chatbots, was there an example of somebody ordering a pizza, and they were, the chatbot was asking, what would you like on your pizza? And the person said, I don't know, ham, but not pepperoni. And the chatbot was merely looking for the foods, and it said, no problem, a pizza with ham and pepperoni. And then he's going, that's not what I ordered. And it's immediately creating frustration and friction and giving a poor user experience. So these systems need to be incredibly intelligent, but to help that along, it's up to us to create this user journey of questions and leading what would you say, conversational tones that help them along the process.
And I think, you're saying, let's move on to this slide here, but obviously the big picture is important, but I'm sure you're going to say also that it's the minutiae and the context around particular bits of thinking and emotional decision making that's really important.
Yeah, well, it is. One of the main things is it's important to understand not only the target users, but as you mentioned, John, it's the context in which this dialogue will appear, because it all needs, again, comes down to your personas, who you're targeting, how you're going to speak to them, and the information that you're giving to them, how relevant is it in a conversational manner. And that lies one of the I guess the hardest aspects of voice user interface design. And it's going to be one of the biggest challenges that we'll all be facing. So it'll be tough and exciting at the same time when that arrives, I can only imagine.
Good stuff. And then I think, we're going to talk about Agile a bit later, but certainly one of the things you and the team are doing quite a lot of at the moment is making sure that the whole UX process is very iterative and involves lots of validation with both end users and with stakeholders on the client side as well, which I think is probably what you're going to be talking about on this screen here. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, basically within the UX process, a lot of the times we'll meet up with stakeholders for kickoff meetings, and yes, business goals must be met, but a lot of it's with a very, very internal focus. And you will have marketing departments that, they have their own goals and needs and wants, but you constantly need to flip this on its head and follow what the user wants. And with that, tangible research that you've done, you're finding out you hope that they align with the business goals, but they could expose, massive information gaps. And that's where, as I mentioned earlier, you have card sorting techniques. During workshops, you're doing user experience mapping exercises, and that figures out holistically how someone interacts with a product or your service or your brand as a whole. And you're trying to find these pain points. And that's, once you discover these things, then you're implementing them into wireframes for stakeholders. They're very, very low fidelity prototypes, and you can start doing usability testing, guerrilla testing, and within the imagery here on the slide, you can see some high fidelity mock-ups. You bring these into, Envision, Principle, and that's where you can get, your hands on these, because at the end of the day, paper prototypes and so forth are great for conversational pieces, but having it on a device and in the user's hand is phenomenal. And now this is where it lies when it comes to voice user interface design, prototyping in that regard. It's almost going to become more, similar to a job of nearly a sound engineer, because you're going to be recording, you're going to be picking the right persona, the right tone of voice, and how it's recorded and delivered. All key factors in people's experience. I suppose it would be, you would relate it to accessibility on a device. Aesthetically, how easy and is text on a page to read? Is a small font size, for example. This could be, reflective of the volume of the voice, background noise, reverb. They sound very trivial, but I personally feel, it's all very important to someone's, conception of your brand and how this is sold to them,
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely massive area. I'm just a bit slightly mindful of time, obviously, just because we've got a few other bits to cover off, and we're already towards the end of our time. So I hope people don't mind staying with us a little bit longer. We're not going to be too much longer. That is the sort of bulk of the presentation, was around this whole area of UX and what the challenges are going to be moving forward, particularly with screenless design. In terms of integration and why we expect to see more of that, that's another interesting area for us. And I think, going back to what Stephen was talking about, richer consumer experiences mean that actually the amount of data we want to pull from different sources is rapidly increasing all the time. So if we look at what you typically have within a standard digital approach, you're always going to have your content management systems, your CRMs, your social media insights, your tracking tools like Lead Forensics, potentially conversion tools as well, like Salesforce, Pardot, Optimizely, HubSpot, Mailer, Eloqua, that's not on there. You're going to have apps as well. But what's often forgotten about is that there are a lot of different areas of data that users also want to see. So location services, language, weather, reward schemes, help services, all that sort of stuff can be used collaboratively and together to create a really interesting user experience that allows these user experiences to really sing. Another area is GDPR, and I was never going to be spending too much time talking about it today, but we have got other resources that you can look at regarding GDPR planning. In case you've forgotten, the date is 25th of May 2018, 132 days away apparently. And what that's doing is it's forcing people to think about data more, because obviously if you are in breach of GDPR regulations, you can face large fines. But actually a lot of organizations are embracing it as an opportunity in which to look at how they're gathering data and managing consent, and ultimately thinking about how they can keep a smaller number of customers warm for a longer time and ultimately deliver more results. And the third area is that, unfortunately, with economic pressures in the UK at the moment, we seem to be going through some good months and some bad months, but overall, there's no businesses doing particularly great outside of manufacturing. There's a lot of pressure at the moment to make sure that everyone runs a tight ship. And unfortunately, that is meaning that we are seeing more people, certainly more briefs for ourselves, that are looking around generating efficiencies rather than just pushing for growth. And generating efficiencies normally means putting more services into websites, which means channel shift away from managed services with people. And to do that, you need to have integration, because you need, like Stephen was talking about, to have that ability to replicate the contextually driven, cognitively relevant conversations people are having normally with people within a digital setting. And John Lewis is an example of that. Although this is an article from last year, there's a lot of companies at the moment who are looking at shifting towards an online model away from bricks and mortar or to having staff sat in call centres. And as part of this, we're seeing a move from wAgile or waterfall Agile to more fully Agile processes. And part of the reason for that is that lots of integrations equal lots of suppliers and makes it very difficult to define everything straight away. And I've pulled up an example here of an F1 car, because if in an F1 car you waited for all of the specifications to be ready, so the specification of how you're going to implement the brakes, how you're going to train the driver, what sort of tyre quality that you want, and the overall body, before you considered how you were going to put the whole thing together, you'd almost be waiting infinitely, because the amount of changes that happen to all of the different constituent products and processes within the development of a Formula One car are constantly changing. So actually waiting for them all to align perfectly and then to try and make decisions after that point puts you back. So there's a lot of organisations we're talking to who, although would have been very Agile cautious a couple of years ago, are now actively pushing Agile within their organisations to try and move quickly and stay relevant. The next thing that I think is important is that regular demonstrations in projects like this, which have got lots of integrations, help us to fail early, which is a good thing, which minimises wasted time and budget. So if you look at this here, we've got an example of one of the projects we were running internally last year. The post-it notes might look like just a good reason for putting bits of paper on a wall, but actually what they do is they make the project visual and transparent and allow us to look at things that aren't going well and therefore fix them. And I think the last thing I wanted to talk about is the multidisciplinary delivery teams within Agile projects, where you've got lots of different web services and systems being used, means that organizations have got to move away from their traditional comfort zones. So whereas 10 years ago you might have employed one company to do your entire Agile project, including your online marketing, now we're seeing lots more specialists being used within a wider delivery schedule. And I think as part of that, there's certainly a big emphasis on learning by doing. This was an event I went to in Leeds prior to Christmas, which looked at learning by doing within an Agile framework within the sort of teams that they worked in. And ultimately, if you work in a waterfall where you're trying to find everything up front, you're relying on people who are very quick at picking up information to get all that information out of their heads in specification documents, and then to understand what everybody else is trying to do and spot problems before they happen. Whereas actually, if you work in an Agile way, it's better for the people working on the project, because what they can do is they can look at what's going on in terms of all the different teams, find areas where there might be conflicts or might be duplicated effort, identify them, and then work from there to actually deliver a better project. So that's the end of the formal presentation part of this webinar. Again, apologies that we're a bit over time. But I do think that we've got some questions through. So I've certainly got one, Steve. I know that you're managing the questions, Bob, but I've got one that was sent in prior to the webinar. So one person said that they knew we were going to be talking about UX and about non-mobile as in non-screen design. But within mobile, are there any particular challenges this year that you think are going to come to the fore when it comes to designing for mobile?
Well, yeah, but one of the most predominant ones, I guess, again, it's not necessarily an invisible interface, but gesture is a new thing. And, the iPhone 10, it doesn't have a home button. It's purely gesture based. So these are things that we need to start to consider. Again, new trends that are going to start appearing. And as designers, we need to make sure that we're, ahead of the curve and aware of what's around the corner. And even the likes of the iPhone 10 with the difference in its screen, with the extra bumper at the top. Again, when doing interface design, all these things have to be considered. So we merely can't stick to convention and what we're used to. It's constantly adapting to what's happening in the market. And as frustrating as it can be, you can't put your back against the wall. We have to adapt just as the problems and the solutions for users do as well.
Cool. Okay. Is there any other questions in the questions bucket, Stephen, or shall I carry on with another one?
Yeah, just whatever you have on your end. Whatever you have on your end there, John, would be great.
Okay, bro. So another question I've got here is on so working with technical partners within a UX process. So this is Tim from Woking. He wants to know if he's got multiple technical partners, should he be getting his UX team in from the start, or should he talk to the technical guys first and then get the UX guys in later?
Oh, definitely throughout the process. You can, you get UX involved as early as you can. That's optimum. But early and often, that's the way to go, because what you're exposing from your research, if you're iterating this process and while you have development involved throughout, everybody's on the same page. They're being aware of the same problems, the solutions that you're holistically trying to solve. But again, through prototyping, testing, you may expose problems that weren't apparent during the first sprint. So again, start early, but iterate often. That's the only advice I can give on that. Don't just cram UX into the beginning, stop, ship it off, and that's the end of it, because the end product, by the time it ships, maybe the problem that you're trying to solve for that user in the first place, his behavioral aspects, the demographic that he's in, his environment has changed, maybe the device that it was designed for has changed. These are all things that need to be considered throughout the entire development process.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. And then the last question I've got is probably more directed at myself, which is asking about, if you are doing technical integrations, is there anything in particular you should be aware of in terms of what might limit you from user experience point of view? And I think from that point of view, the key thing is just to make sure that you're looking at solutions that are not technology first. Look at the user first and then think about technology second. Because we are moving towards a situation where almost anything can integrate with anything. Certainly all the technology providers we work with are working on the basis that they have to make all of the data within their systems open and available. So there's a lot of movement towards open APIs and lots of really exciting work being done. And certainly if the first few projects we've been doing this year, which is only sort of 11, 12 days old now, anything to go by, there's a lot of ambition this time of year, and actually more so than there was perhaps 12 months ago. And I think that's down to the fact that people are finding technology products that work well with the products, and therefore they can do more. So okay, I think we'll probably start to wrap things up there. So I think just the last thing for me to do is to remind you of our next webinar, which is on Monday the 5th of February, as we said, and again it's on CMS and CRM integration. And we'll be covering things off in there like why it's important to have single sign-on so people can access all of your services digitally via one click. And also talking about how we can facilitate inquiries and that sort of thing via bi-directional integration. And that's at 3 o'clock on the 5th of February. If you want to get onto that webinar, if you can just email keith@untitled.com and he'll get you onto the list for this time next webinar. So thank you very much again for all of your time, and apologies again that we overran slightly. If there's any questions on the back of this, please do get in contact with us and we'll